Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to the Georgette Heyer Unconference, a century spent having a ball, which is celebrating the publication of Georgette Heyer, History and Historical Fiction, a volume of essays, which is being published by University College of London Press today. I'm Professor Kim Wilkins from the University of Queensland in Australia, as you can tell from my accent, and I'm delighted to be one of the co-editors, along with Associate Professor Samantha Rayner of University College London. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce our very special guest today for a session called The Black Moth and Beyond, and in conversation with Georgette Heyer's biographer, Dr. Jennifer Kloester. Now, Jennifer is a writer of both fiction and non-fiction. Her books include Georgette Heyer's Regency World, an illustrated companion to Heyer's 26 Regency novels, and Georgette Heyer, Biography of a Bestseller. And in researching the latter, Jennifer uncovered 9 previously unpublished Georgette Heyer short stories, which she edited into the collection Snowdrift and Other Stories. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you, Kim. Wonderful to be here. I'm so excited. Congratulations on the fabulous book. It's amazing.
Thank you so much. It was a labor of love, and I'm sure you'll understand that. But I want to open by asking the thing that I always want to know about Heyer fans, and that is, how and when did you discover Heyer, and what did she mean to you then?
Interesting question. My first sighting of a Heyer novel was Cotillion in the glove box of my husband's grandmother's car, and I think at the time I pulled it out and went, oh, what's this? Gosh, romance fiction, and at the time in a stupid way put it back. But a few years later we went to live in the jungle in Papua New Guinea in a mining town, and they had this little, and it was very remote. So we're talking fly in, fly out, very beautiful. And it had a little YWCA library, and they had a big collection of Georgette Heyer paperbacks. And I picked one out, and it was These Old Shades, and I never looked back, and yay for romance and yay for historical fiction, because wow, it was just this incredible world. And then from then on, I read everything that was in the library, and then whenever we went out on R&R or leave, I just hunted for more Heyer. And then we came back to Australia, and some years after that, we went to live in the Middle East. We went from the wettest place on earth to the driest place on earth. And the library there had an entire collection of Georgette Heyer in hardback and paperback. And so I would read her as my comfort reading, rereading her novels. And yeah, that was where it all sort of began.
And so somehow you went from there to wanting to write about her life and works. What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, it was 2 things. I had a really good friend in Bahrain, and an American who had studied at Brown and was doing a PhD at Yale. And I introduced her to Georgette Heyer, and she also fell in love with her. And we would talk about the books and discuss the plot, the characters and things. And we used to just yearn for some kind of a book, a companion that would explain things to us. Things like, well, what did a barouche look like? What was a Spencer? What were boots of Jean? You know, what did these things mean? And morning calls that seemed to happen in the afternoon, and all this etiquette. And I mean, obviously you learn a lot from Jane Austen, but she's writing for her peers, for her contemporary, you know, those who live in her world. So she doesn't need to explain any of those things. But for us in the 20th and 21st centuries, we don't know what carriages and footmen and ostlers and what's blowing up a yard of tin. So we thought it'd be wonderful as this book. So I came back to Australia thinking, wouldn't that be marvellous? And I'd finished my Bachelor of Arts, which I'd done as an off-campus student living in these environments. And I'd said to my husband, look, before I get a real job, I just want to do this 6-month little private research project. And it was reading every Heyer novel in chronological order and marking up anything that I thought would be mysterious or not familiar to a modern reader. And I then created, this is really OCD, I have to tell you. And I then created these alphabetical card index files and books of alphabetical entries, which, you know, with this idea of creating what was going to be called the sort of, I don't know, Georgette Heyer companion or something like that. Anyway, I'd had this marvelous lecturer at Deakin University where I was an off-campus student, and he'd been a real mentor in teaching me history and research skills and all those things you do at uni. And we had lunch one day, and I actually told him about this, what I thought of as a sort of little research project. And he sat back in his chair. He was the first person I told, and said, and I thought, oh, he's going to say, what a waste of time. Don't be silly. And he sat back and he said, you know what? That'd make a fantastic PhD.
Oh, wow.
And I literally had this epiphany, me in a puffy hat.
I'm so glad that that's what you were focused on.
I go, oh, well, I'd never thought of doing a PhD, you know. And actually for years, my daughter thought that PhDs stood for Puffy Hat Day.
Oh, that's a good one, Puffy Hat Day. I'll have to remember.
Puffy Hat Day. Yeah. So I actually, with his encouragement and with this moment of inspiration and really, really yearning to see this marvellous writer, as I thought of Georgette Heyer, you know, this extraordinary woman who'd written this incredible number of books, all of which have something new in them. And yet she didn't seem to be being acknowledged in the way that I thought she should be. So I guess it was sort of the beginning of this mission, or this journey of really wanting to find out more about her writing, her life, and to see her properly acknowledged. And so I went on and I did honours, and then I got a PhD scholarship to do my PhD on Georgette Heyer, writing the Regency, Georgette Heyer, history and fiction, from Regency back to Lady of Quality.
Oh, amazing. And when you were writing that, and also when you were writing the biography, you had access to unbelievable amounts of letters and papers and so on. And you have a marvelous story about your interactions with Jane Aiken Hodge. Would you tell us about that?
Oh, that was just amazing. So I began my PhD in 2001, suffering badly from imposter syndrome, as I think many people do. And anyway, I really wanted to find out from the people who had, you know, who either had known Heyer, or who had some really, you know, important relationship with her work. And Jane Aiken Hodge was an obvious one. So I wrote off to England, asking her if I could meet with her and interview her. And she very kindly invited me to her home for lunch. And she lived in Sussex, in Lewes, just near the railway station. So I went off on my first really big research trip as a PhD student to England, and went and had this lunch with Jane. And she just was this extraordinary woman, little but just so sharp, like this extraordinary mind. And she, of course, had this extraordinary history too. She was not only a novelist in her own right. You know, she'd written about Jane Austen, she'd written about Regency women. She'd also been married to Alan Hodge, who had co-written The Long Weekend with Robert Graves. So she had all these extraordinary literary connections as well. So anyway, I get there and she says, oh, now I've had my housekeeper bring down from my attic my research folders for the private life of the private world of Georgette Heyer, the biography she'd published in 1984. And I thought you might like to have a look at them. And I'm sort of trying not to go, are you kidding? Anyway, they were sitting there on the table in the dining room, and we went off into the kitchen, had lunch in the kitchen. And then we went outside into the garden, had this marvellous talk all about Georgette Heyer and her research and this and that. Really came time to leave, and I hadn't had a chance to look at these 12 folders that were sitting on the table. So I quickly opened the first one, and there's like original letters to her, from Georgette Heyer to her agent, and there are photographs of the house in which she lived, and there's all these conversation, interview notes that Jane had taken with people who had known, like A.S. Frere of Heinemann, people who were no longer alive, who had known Georgette Heyer really well, Max Reinhardt of the Bodley Head, all sorts of people. So I'm just thinking, well, I had to go because, you know, you don't want to outstay your welcome. Anyway, so I'm looking through the first one, and Jane said, look, just take anything you want. And I'm thinking, well, I can't do that, because to break up a research archive like that as a you know, historian to me, it's like a sin. You know, you don't do that, because you're then taking everything out of context and you're losing provenance. So I said, oh, no, that's okay. Oh, perhaps I could come back sometime, you know, thinking Australia to England. And I had a really full research schedule, but, you know. And then after a minute, she said, oh, look, why don't you just take it? Take the lot. And before I could say anything, she disappeared out of the room. And a minute later, a couple of minutes later, she came back with this swan Hellenic cabin bag. I've still got it. Can't bear to part with it. And proceeded to shove these folders into the bag, zipped it up and thrust it into my arms. I sort of grabbed this thing. She then ushered me to the front door, said, wonderful to meet you and blah-da-da, and saw me off the premises. So I'm hugging this bag with these folders. I didn't dare open it between there and my digs in London. I got back to my room, this little room in International Students' House, and I opened it up, and I tell you, you could have offered me the crown jewels and I would have said no for that bag. I've still got them. They're just sitting there on the shelf, and they are this wonderful gold mine of material and information.
That's amazing. And it's such a beautiful story, a kind of a passing of the baton, you know, from one generation to the next. It's so beautiful.
It's funny you should say that, because anytime we went back to England, my husband sometimes came with me. I went back, I did 9 research trips over the years, beginning from my PhD to sort of after Regency, after the biography was published. And we would always go and take Jane out for lunch. And she did one day, standing in her garden, said, you know, that day when I gave you those folders, I felt like I was passing the mantle to you.
That's teary. Stop. That's beautiful.
It makes me really tear up too. She was amazing, and it was so sad because she died in 2009, and she's a real loss. But she read the manuscript of the biography.
Oh, good. That's good. So she did
before she died. That was actually a really interesting thing, because I had 2 people I would send my drafts to, Jane and Jean Frere, and she was the daughter-in-law of A.S. Frere of Heinemann, and she had actually worked as an editor of the Bodley Head. And so I had, and that the Freres had been amazing, because I'd realised in the course of my research that Georgette must have been writing personal letters as well as business letters to Frere, who was the CEO of Heinemann, and with whom she became great friends from 1937, with him and his wife, Pat Wallace, who was Edgar Wallace's daughter. So there's all these incredible literary connections. So Georgette's son, Sir Richard Rougier, gave me the address to write to the Freres, and I did write to them and said, you know, do you have any letters? And they wrote back and said, well, they did. They had an archive. And I said, well, could I possibly look at it? So they wrote off to Sir Richard and said, who is this Jennifer Kloester? And fortunately, Richard and I had become really good friends, and he'd been incredibly kind, giving me access to all his mother's papers and notebooks, and having me to stay, he and his wife, Judy, Lady Rougier, every time I was in England, I would go and stay for a few days with them. And each time he would tell me more and more about Georgette, or he'd bring out another, like his mother's baby, her mother's baby book, in which she'd recorded bits of the first 5 years of Georgette's life, and the African photo album and the family album. So each visit more and more. Anyway, so the Freres had written to Richard to say, you know, who was I? And he wrote back and said that I was very good news, which I thought was really, really lovely of him. So they then, the Freres then invited me to stay with them, complete stranger, and they had me to stay for 4 days while I transcribed that archive. 93 letters, 70,000 words. In 4 days?
Yeah. Are you a touch typist?
No. 3 fingers and a thumb.
Oh my goodness. You should get some kind of medal for that. So in writing about Heyer, you must have come across some great stories about the composition of some of our favourite books. And so I'd ask, given it's the 100th anniversary of the Black Moth, I mean, Heyer must have been very young when she wrote it and when it was published.
She was 17 when she made it up for her brother, Boris, who was her junior by 5 years. She had 2 brothers, Boris and Frank, and she was probably closest to Boris. Anyway, he was convalescing from an illness. He was always quite sickly and had probably what we would now call bipolar. And so they'd gone down, the family had gone down to Hastings. I always mix up Hastings with Worthing because her grandparents lived in Worthing. Anyway, and he was convalescing and they were bored. Georgette actually says in one of her early biographical pieces they were bored. So she makes up this story about Jack Carstairs, the Earl of Wincham, and how he's turned highwayman because on a point of honour, he's said that he cheated at cards in order to save his brother. Something that I think many modern readers would sort of go, what? Like, you know, but this is the code of honour that, of course, many people did live by, and some still do. And so she makes up this story, and then her father, who was very literary and with whom Georgette had an incredibly close relationship, they used to read each other's work and they would actually edit and proofread each other's work. He, as she said, he thought well of it, and he encouraged her to write it out in her best copperplate handwriting, which she no longer had in later years. She's quite hard to decipher at times, and send it off to a publisher. And she did that. And when she was 18, Constable, the publisher in Orange Street, very well-known publisher, offered her a contract with a £100 advance. And the earliest letters extant are the ones in the British Library, the Society of Authors Archive. And there's a handful of these where Georgette is writing to the Society of Authors Archive about the contract she's received as an 18-year-old for this book. And she has a few questions about some of the clauses in the contract. And a second letter, obviously she's had a reply from the Society of Authors, and she says, you know, as to clause 17, I was going to ask for this higher royalty, but as it's my first book, I don't think I will. I'll wait and see, you know, for the second and third books. So she clearly had other books in mind, even at that incredibly young age. Yeah. So the book was published on in September of 1921, a month after her 19th birthday. And it's never been out of print.
That's incredible. And I guess it's because, you know, we talk about Heyer and her ability to recreate historical periods so effectively, that sometimes we forget about her own historical period. And the span of her career, I mean, it's a very long span, but she saw some of the most incredible moments in 20th century history. I mean, what was she doing? Where did she go during the World War II, for example? Was she writing then? Did she leave London? How did that happen?
A remarkably prolific period for her, actually. Okay. So they were living in Sussex when the war broke out in 1939 in a house called Blackthorns in a little tiny hamlet called Tote Hill. She always, once they came back, they lived overseas in East Africa and then in Macedonia for a few years. In 1930, they came back to England. Georgette wanted to have a family, said she could only do that if they were living in England. And so Ronald was a mining engineer at the time, couldn't be a mining engineer living in London or in a you know, those sort of environs. So he bought a lease on a sports store and they moved down to West Sussex near Horsham. So they settled in Blackthorns from 1934 or late 33 until 1939 or early 40. Actually, December 1939 they moved. So they had these 7 years at Blackthorns where she wrote a dozen novels. Wow. And then war broke out, and of course for the first several months it was the phony war. But in May of 1940, when they were still living at Blackthorns, Ronald's brother, who was a professional soldier, he was a lieutenant colonel in the Lancashire Fusiliers, and he was in Belgium at the time of Dunkirk, and he was killed at Tiegham Ridge on the 22nd of May 1940. And I think, you know, and it was just after that that the Blitz began. And so they would have the bombers flying over. Richard, their son, was only 8 at the time. And so obviously it became concerning for them. You know, as Georgette once said, she didn't mind. She said, you know, they're on a rat run, and when the bombers left London, they would drop their last bit over Sussex. And she said she didn't mind for her, but she minded for her son Richard. They eventually sent him away to boarding school. So in December 1940, they moved to a flat in Brighton, a service flat on Kingscliff, and she wrote a couple of books there, Envious Casca and Pharaoh's Daughter. Pharaoh's Daughter, she wrote straight to the typewriter, single-spaced because of the paper shortage, in under a month.
Oh, gosh. You raise a really interesting point, which is something that I always like to think about writers. You know, sometimes it's as though books just sort of spontaneously appear on shelves, but they're not. They're the product of labor and lots of it, hours and hours of it. Well, maybe not so many hours in her case.
Yes.
So give us a picture. What does it look like when Georgette Heyer sits down to write? I mean, is she always typed? Did she smoke? Did she have an office? Did she have notebooks all around her? What does it look like? Give us a picture.
Okay, these are great questions. So the first thing she does before she starts writing is she sits down and she thinks out her characters. So she either sits down on a couch or a sofa and plays patience, or she does a jigsaw, a really difficult jigsaw. I've got one of them upstairs. A beautiful wooden jigsaw, has no straight sides and has no picture. 500 pieces, and then some of the pieces are shaped like birds or different animals, trees. It's really beautiful. Anyway, so she would sit there and she would think out her characters, her dramatis persona, as she used to call it, and then she would think up a plot, and then she'd drop the characters into a scene. And the book would apparently just write itself from there. I mean, she did say once, you know, to Freya, why, oh, why do those people who think writing is as simple as falling off a log never write a book themselves? Mm-hmm. Because it was hard work, but she had an extraordinary facility. So in the early years, she wrote by hand, right through until 1940, when she was writing Pharaoh's Daughter in 41. She would write them by hand, and then they'd be sent off. She'd send them off to a typist. In 1935 or 34, when she was writing, 34, 35, when she was writing An Infamous Army, she actually had a woman, Sylvia Gamble, come to the house at Blackthorns in Totill, and Sylvia stayed there, and Georgette would read her manuscript that she'd already written, and Sylvia would type it for her. But mostly she would send out the copy to her agent, who would send it to a typist, and then, or once she was settled in Sussex, she would find a local typist. But when the war began, finding a typist actually became really difficult. And there was also the danger that her manuscript, if she posted it, could get destroyed in the bombing. And so when writing Pharaoh's Daughter, she couldn't get a typist in Brighton for love nor money, as she said. She didn't want to send it to London because of the danger. And so she decided she would have to type it herself. And that's how she came to type it. She said she went on and on without stopping, except for one hitch which lasted for an hour, where she sat back and wondered what was going to happen to all the people in the novel.
Oh, gosh. Well,
wrote that in less than a month.
Very different from how I write, let's just say.
Yeah, me too. After that, she really pretty much typed her novels. And the interesting thing is that she didn't keep her manuscripts. Apart from An Infamous Army and My Lord John, she destroyed all of her manuscripts. So she would send it off to the publisher, or to her agent, who would then send it to the publisher, and then she would get the proof pages back and the manuscript. And then once the proof pages were amended and sorted and finalised and had gone to the printer, she'd destroy the manuscript.
Oh, goodness me. She had no idea how important those would be one day. We've actually only got time for one more question. We have been, yes, I know, but it's one I wanted to ask you since when we were setting up this conversation. You wrote in one of your emails, she would have loved to know we were having an academic conversation about her, though she would never have admitted it publicly. So I wondered if you could just unpack that for us, why you said that.
Well, I think, she was her own worst PR agent. She not only refused all interviews and, wouldn't do publicity and didn't believe in publicity, but she became so self-deprecating. She wasn't like that in her 20s. It was a gradual thing. And I think, most authors have very fragile egos. They want to know what they wrote was good and not just popular. And it's interesting because I think literary fiction writers often want popular sales, and popular fiction writers often want literary kudos. And it's hard to get both. And actually, Heyer has had both, but I don't know that it's ever enough. I think it's a bit of a bottomless well for most authors. You know, you tell them a book is great and they might believe you, but then the next book is a whole new ballgame. And I think that very much happened to Heyer. So one of her codes was this belief, and it comes through in her novels, and she even says it in one of her novels, that the greatest sin is the sin of vulgarity. And to Heyer, vulgarity also embodied, as she would say, puffing off your own work, talking about, you know, she going to a party and saying, oh, well, I'm Georgette Heyer and, you know, I write books and blah, blah, blah. She just would have thought that was utterly appalling. And she would criticize occasionally other writers who, you know, sort of talked, you know, madly about their books and know how much they felt them. And Francis Brett Young, who'd go and read his manuscript aloud to his publisher. And she just thought that sort of thing was utterly dreadful and vulgar. So she would never do it. She loved getting serious letters from her fans. And she actually had a lovely correspondence with a teenager from Australia who wrote to her after the war. She was very worried that her favourite author was starving, while Georgette was actually living in Albany, just off Piccadilly, and would shop at Fortnum and Mason and Harrods. And so Rosemary wrote to her. She was living in Shepperton, and she and her mother would send Georgette food parcels, dried fruit cakes, you know. And Georgette just obviously thought this was just so sweet. So she wrote these wonderful half dozen letters. She would send Rosemary a signed copy of her new book and write these long, chatty letters about her life and her family, and just gorgeous. But by and large, she didn't like gushing fan mail. She didn't want people to think her books were sweetly pretty, because they're not, you know. And that's one of the terrible things that I think too many people who've not read Heyer just sort of have decided that, you know, because she's a woman, perceived as writing for women, that she's not worth paying attention to, which is an appalling myth, but unfortunately a persistent one even into the 21st century. Not only that, but Heyer actually was widely read by everybody, men and women, throughout her writing life, and from across the social demographic as well. So, you know, she was we're all unique, but she had her own way. She could be snobbish, but she could be incredibly gregarious and accepting. She could be quite bigoted, but she could be very embracing. So I find her very light and dark. And that was one of the things when Jane Aiken-Hodge and Jean Frere were reading my manuscript. I had this one evening where I rang them both, and they both read the latest draft. And Jane said, now, Jennifer, dear, do be careful. You must not write a hagiography. It's very important that you bring out the dark parts and you reveal Heyer, you know, some of the difficult parts. And Jean said, Jennifer, be very careful. Don't write too much. It's, you know, don't be so hard on her. You're being very hard on her. You know, make sure that you know, tell us about the good things. So I thought, well, I must have got the balance about right. But she's a difficult subject in many ways, because I don't think she was an easy person. And I think there's, particularly in this modern era of cancel culture, there's this, you know, some people, I think, feel that if a person is not someone they perhaps approve of or would have liked or don't agree with some of their points of view, then their work becomes unworthy. And I think that's a terrible mistake, because if you go back through history, there are many great and wonderful, marvellous writers who we revere and esteem and study, who would have opinions and points of view that are no longer considered acceptable, but were unthought of or unquestioned in their time. And I think Heyer is one of those people, in some small ways. You know, by and large, her books are just extraordinary, and they're delightful, and they endure, which is, like, you know, why we're talking. And you've written an outstandingly good introduction to your collection, may I say, because you actually make this argument and you raise these points about, well, why does she endure? What is it about her that keeps her, you know, she hasn't yet been turned into a television series or a film, which she should be, you know, particularly given the successes of Downton Abbey and Bridgerton. There's clearly an appetite for historical drama. And she's so witty and clever, you know, this master of ironic comedy.
And she keeps gathering fans. I teach Venetia in one of my courses, and every time I teach it, I gather about, 4 or 5 very, very hardcore Heyer fans, which is marvelous.
That is a brilliant novel.
It's my favorite.
Well, I'm not surprised. That's from her golden era. So during the war, they actually moved from Brighton in 1942 to Albany, and she lived in Albany for 24 years, and that was the golden age. So, the 1950s. I mean, obviously, she's written wonderful books like The Foundling and Reluctant Widow, Arabella. But 50s, she writes, The Grand Sophie, The Quiet Gentleman with the brilliant Drusilla Morville. I just adore Drusilla. Cotillion, which is an amazing book, which has its own 4 couples, just like a cotillion, the dance. And so that's amazing. The Tollgate, which is one of her, rural sort of books set in Derbyshire. Bath Tangle, April Lady, Sprig Muslin, Sylvester, Venetia, the brilliant, incredible Unknown Ajax, which has one of the most magnificent plot structures of any book. And then 1961, A Civil Contract. And then Frederica in 1965, Black Sheep 66, extraordinary. And this is the thing, even in 1966, when she'd been writing for nearly 50 years, she was still able, as she said herself, to produce a new kind of hero.
That's marvelous. It's amazing.
Yeah.
We are going to have to leave it there. Yeah. It's been such a delight talking to you, Jen.
And to you.
Yeah.
I hope lovely. It's been delightful, and congratulations on the book.
Oh, thank you very much. Means a lot.
Okay. No, it's superb. Everyone should read it.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.
And take care. Bye.